Good morning, listeners. We actually have Dr. Dowling on the phone. Dr. Doling, Dr. Dowling. We just had a good little laugh. Again, you're tuned into Vibe 103. The new show is called The Outlet from 10 to 12, maybe potentially till 1 today because there's so much to cover. But Dr. Dowling's actually on the line. And just a little brief history about him. In 2002, him and his wife, Dr. Laura Dowling, opened Bermuda's first integrated health practice, offering a collaboration of medical and chiropractic care. A little perfect team. Dr. Henry Dowling specializes in family-based medical care with a focus on internal medicine, pediatrics, prenatal care, and geriatrics, while Dr. Laura Dowling, his wife, is a family chiropractor. And in 2018, Dr. Dowling became the first Bermudian physician to introduce a new healthcare model, direct primary care, DPC to be short, to our island shores. And direct primary care is membership-based healthcare model for 24-hour direct physician access, inclusive of virtual medicine. So again, Dr. Dowling, so excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, whichever you prefer, Dowling or Doling, let the public know, let myself know, and then I'd be more than happy to address you correctly, but welcome.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And either way of pronouncing it is fine. So
Okay, great.
I will answer to either one.
Okay, great.
You're not helping with that.
I know.
What about Dr. D?
And that's how I'm known as well, Dr. D.
All right. D&D. So yeah, go ahead. So obviously, as you know, we've been talking about many things. We've touched a little bit on the 14-day quarantine. I think what I would really like, and potentially the listeners, and a little more information and your thoughts on the treatment of COVID-19 using ivermectin.
Okay, not a problem. So, as it stands now, we don't have any official treatments outside of the hospital for COVID-19. I say official because there's nothing been officially licensed for treatment for COVID-19. There are many things that are potentially in the pipeline, but that doesn't help us now. And it definitely didn't help us back when things were really bad and we didn't have a clue what was going on. Where you have countries that have a lot of expensive or access to a lot of expensive care. There were many things that were tried, many things that were failing. But in other countries where they didn't have access to a lot of expensive medicine, they kind of went back to basic principles and looked and see, like most doctors, what's in my bag, and let me see if what I have in my bag will work. And so what ended up happening is you started to note out of certain places such as Africa, South America, Brazil, those places, there were introductions of medicines that we wouldn't have known necessarily attributed to viral illnesses, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin being the two main ones, that were being thought of as being, hey, these drugs, we're using them, and we're actually getting some success. Now, like Dr. Sifu Khan had kind of said, in our kind of side of the world where allopathic medicine reigns supreme, it is the principle of, it might work, but you have to prove it. And in proving it, that's where you start to get into some issues, because to prove it in this day and age means doing probably very multi-centered or very expensive trials that include a lot of people, and then you provide all your data to certain bodies, and those bodies will therefore either give you the stamp of approval to go ahead or not give you the stamp of approval. Now, that's where we're now starting to get in sticking points, because there have been trials that have come out with the most recent medication that's been used, which is ivermectin, that have actually shown great success with very little downside. Ivermectin is a medication that's been out for easily 40 years. It's in the World Health Organization's most top 10 drugs that should be used. So it's been used, it's been tested, it has been well known, and it is FDA-approved drug. However, it initially came out as a medication to not treat viruses, but to treat parasites. And so that is the thought process that still kind of gets stuck in most people's minds. Why would I use a drug for parasites to treat viruses. And the answer to that is that just because it treats parasites doesn't mean it doesn't treat viruses. It's just that up until now, no studies had really been done. There were a few studies earlier, even before the pandemic, that had shown the potential of ivermectin being used for viruses. But, at that time, there were other medications that it was competing against, and those medications proved to be either better at treating those viruses, and so it was kind of left on the back burner. Fast forward to COVID-19, and all those other viral medications that we had been using were not working. And so when we started to see ivermectin actually showing good success, it started to make its rounds within the frontline workers. Those are the doctors and the nurses that are out there in the field trying to actually take care of patients, whether they're mildly ill or very ill. But it was hard to get past there because once you started to ask those in charge to look at this on a large scale, they would not look at it. And that was the frustration of a lot of us, because it was like, how do we convince you that this medication actually works when you're not willing to either look at the data? And so if you look at the most recent thing out of the CDC, where they said they did not recommend ivermectin for use of COVID-19, they actually admitted, but we have not looked at the data. So that kind of goes against the grain. How are you saying don't use it, but you can't use any data because you haven't looked at the data? So this is where our sticking point is, because we have a lot of colleagues that will not even look at it until you get larger organizations who will clear it for use. And that comes from many different things. That is either uncomfortableness to try something new, or try something that is not actually given a stamp of approval by your guiding body, or even the fact that, hey, let's be real, I don't want to get in trouble with my insurance company or get sued for using something that's not been approved. But I don't think anyone can actually say it doesn't work. What they can say is that there's not enough proof. And that's where we're in a sticking point right now, because we have people who are either sick or dying, who could have at least a try at it without very little, if any, downside, but yet there are people who are just unwilling to even look at it, and that's where we're now having a problem.
Right. So my thoughts on that, and forgive me if I'm trying to word this the best way possible. We have, obviously, the experimental gene therapy. And like you said, people are arguing, saying, ivermectin has not been through the clinical trials to prove that it actually works for COVID-19. But what clinical trials have been done for the experimental gene therapy to prove that it is okay to use? When it's not even, it has not, to my knowledge, been approved by the FDA. It's only been authorized for emergency use only. Right.
So we're talking about the current vaccines that are out there for use in treating the COVID-19. And you're correct. They are all being used under emergency authorization currently. That is a separate entity from FDA. You have actually had a license by FDA. And, by all means, I tell people, please go on the FDA's website, go on the CDC's website, even go to, with our current, we use Pfizer, even go to Pfizer's website and look at their EUA documentation, so that you can see that we're not lying to anybody. We're simply stating that the government to this point says there is no FDA-approved medication or vaccine for treating COVID-19. We are still in this phase of, we have something that looks amazingly promising. It hasn't been able to go through its full testing, because up until now, most vaccines, full testing takes years. But we're in an emergency. People are dropping, people are sick, and we can't necessarily wait till the full vetting that we would normally do. So we're going to kind of do some things in parallel. So the stage 3 or stage 4, however what you would call it, of normal process of clearing vaccines before you actually release it to the mainstream is actually underway as we are in this emergency use authorization. So Everybody who decides to take it, that's why, just like if you are in an experiment, you have to sign to say that I realize this is an experiment, I realize that we don't know all the facts, and that because of that, we could potentially have negative consequences as well as positive consequences. If you realize that, please sign here before we give you this medication. This is a standard protocol for anything that is under trial, because we want people to be fully understanding their risk and their benefits before we give them these medications. And that's not to say that these vaccinations aren't working, because I am very pleased to see how we have less incidence of COVID-19 in the populations that were suffering the most. Your elderly, your very frail and invalid who have potentially a disadvantage when it comes to fighting this virus naturally. So by taking this, they've improved their odds of not getting sick and or dying from this. And this is where you decide, hey, it is better for me to take the risk of this not fully approved vaccine and take my chances there than to risk catching a disease which, according to the statistics put out by all the major bodies, this population of elderly and older people or people who have diseases that are high in inflammation are at high risk. I don't have a problem with that. I counsel all my patients about that, and we go ahead and look at the pros and cons. The problem comes, however, once you decide to now test this medication on those who are not high risk, and then what happens is the risk-benefit ratio changes, and now you have to decide, well, is my risk of catching this disease and getting sick and or dying from it at such a high rate that it is worth me taking this vaccine at this time? And if not, then I should feel comfortable waiting, making sure that if anything happens, I can step into my doctor's office and get the help that I need. The help, of course, being that we have now ivermectin, we have fluoxetine, we have, several other medications that we've tried to impress people just to bolster their immune system with really good data to back it up. But if you don't want to believe it, then that's where we have a problem.
Right.
So Dr. Darling, quick question for you. So the way you explained that, again, excellent. Just again, thank you for always being so balanced and comprehensive with your questions. And what's happening now is like a war is being waged on people for having questions. And it's like, you have to have all this credibility. Even you need to be a medical doctor now to talk, because, even somebody like Dr. Seafood Reginald Can, who was just on the radio, he couldn't be qualified enough to speak on something like this, according to mainstream trend of thought. So I just want to make it clear that there's no one concerned with anything you just said. That's the sense I get. What the concern is that other than in rare instances like you speaking right now on the radio, that's not what we're hearing. And it doesn't really take a medical doctor to determine that someone's not telling you the whole story. What we're hearing is, it's safe. The risks are like zero. Like, no, it's safe. Just take it. It's like this effort to throw this thing around like candy. Even though candy is not even really good for you, but that's a whole nother thing.
You
but
go old school glass candy.
Yeah. But we're throwing it around, and meanwhile, there's mountains of information. And if anyone is actually looking at data, if you go to the pharmaceutical companies, they're not talking the way politicians are talking. Not at all. They say the truth over and over and over because they know that there are legalities surrounding the language that they use. So they make sure that they say it over and over that it's not approved. But we're using language like it's approved. They make sure over and over that it's experimental. But when you say experimental, then you get question of why you call it an experimental. Well, we'll call it an experimental because that's what it is.
Right.
So what I guess What are you sensing around your colleagues? And I know you have your own practice, so you're not necessarily up and around other physicians all the time. But like, are you getting the same sense that people are not using comprehensive, explanations when the patients are coming in around this?
Yeah, it is frustrating, and I don't. I just came from church, so I'm in a good mood today.
Let's keep you in a good mood.
I don't hold my colleagues at fault because they simply follow a pattern that we're taught in school. You kind of follow the trail, where some of the older guys did their own trailblazing. So we're not really taught to do that, to step outside of the line. And if you do that, then there are consequences. I remember when I first came back to Bermuda, I was a doctor who assisted in home birth. And I quickly got a letter from the head gynecology department at the hospital that said, "Welcome back. You need to cease and desist because if you want to go ahead and do that, you need to go ahead and get fully licensed and insured as we are to do that. But other than that, we really don't want you doing that." So there's a very big discomfort that comes from actually stepping outside of the normal box. And to be fair, most physicians are taught, and Dr. Sipu Khan even brought that up, most of our medical doctor physicians are taught to think about worst-case scenarios. So that's what they always have on their mind. If something goes wrong, so I should give somebody something in case something goes wrong. Even our current, when we're delivering babies, we have, from their point of view, what happens if this, and this, all these bad things happen? Now, you end up having a midwife deliver it, and their point of view is those bad things very rarely happen, so we're going to assume this is going to be a natural birth, wonderful output until something else changes. But you want somebody to be prepared for the bad stuff, because if the bad stuff comes, you want somebody who can fix the bad stuff. So, I give them a pass a lot of times because I realize that's the thought process that you come from. However, at some point, you have to also understand that the autonomy of that person who you are treating has to be respected and held up above all else. It has to be that they have the freedom to choose to either accept a medication that you feel is in their best interest, or accept a way of treatment that you feel is in their best interest, or not. And not to look down upon them, not to belittle them, not to make them feel that somehow they are wrong or bad, and definitely not to somehow punish them for making a decision that you do not agree with. And I think this is the state of affairs that not just Bermuda, but this world is in, that if you disagree with us, then not only will we shun you, but we potentially will punish you. And that is a scary situation. I have physicians who do question, but they won't question out loud because they're concerned about their livelihood. They're concerned about, their children in the school. They're concerned about keeping their job or keeping their credentials. All of this stuff has potential ramifications. And so you have to kind of start thinking, I want to help people, but I can't do that if I don't have my job.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough.
And just to touch on, so again, I'm not a doctor, but my question is this. I understand the concept of a vaccine. You give a little bit of the virus, or a little bit of, let's just say, let's use mumps or measles, rubella, the MMR, for example. So you give a little bit to your child, a little bit of the virus, I guess you would call it. Would you say it a virus? How would you?
It depends on what you're trying to defeat. Okay. So most of them are viral illnesses, so you're trying to give them something from the virus.
Right, so I understand the concept of injecting a little bit, it goes into the body, then your body builds immune to antibodies for it, you have a little dose, so that way, you go in for your booster, and then you should be pretty much set, your antibodies are strong enough, so if you were to get hit with measles, mumps, or rubella, your immune system's it's already in there, it's stored, it's into your body, it thinks it's already had it, in a what would you say, a synthetic version?
Well, it's built. It's built as an immune response for
right.
it. Yeah.
And so I understand that. So what's the difference between those types of vaccines that have been around for so long, and then you have this experimental gene therapy over here on this side?
So up until this most recent iteration of vaccines, our traditional vaccines were taking the entity itself, the virus itself, altering it so that it wouldn't make you ill, and then injecting it into you so your body could recognize the virus but not get sick from the virus. And once it recognized it as not being part of you, then it would mount the appropriate immune response by, producing antibodies and potentially also making other types of immune changes so that you have long-term immunity. That's not given to every single vaccine, which is why you end up getting boosters for some vaccinations. That is slightly different than when you have the actual illness, because in most cases when one develops an illness, they don't just make antibodies, but they form other types of immune systems, that have other fancy names, cytotoxic T cells, B cells, the whole work, but they ultimately provide a lot more memory to your body to remember those infections if they ever come back later on. That's not necessarily granted when you get a vaccination. But we don't all get vaccinations for everything we had as a child because, what we are exposed to as a child potentially can make us a lot sicker than if we're exposed to it as an adult. Pertussis is one of those illnesses that gives children whooping cough. And as a baby, having to have, tightness in the chest and all that is very dangerous to their existence. As an adult, it is more inconvenient but less dangerous. And so we, for a long time, did not vaccinate adults for pertussis because it really didn't cause them any real harm. But we've started doing that again, and this is where you get back into more public health kind of treatment with the thought process that even if we're not worried about you, we want you to stop giving it to those who are at most risk. So we vaccinate the adults so they protect the infants and the elderly who are at most vulnerability. That is kind of what they're using now as a reason to some extent to vaccinate those who are potentially at low risk. They're not vaccinating them particularly for themselves, but they use the excuse that they are vaccinating them for those around them who might be at risk. In theory, once again, I don't have a problem with that as long as that's what you're telling me you're doing it for, and you're doing it with a medication that has been well vetted so that I can know and that you can know all the potential risks that are potentially coming from this. And this is, once again, where I have an issue because where you have many people who will say this current vaccine has no side effects or has no potential of having any problems. The obvious the obvious spike in the virus system, the vaccine system online that kind of picks up any kind of adverse reactions, has spiked hugely since we've started using this vaccine. We've used vaccines for an umpteen years, and if you go on their system, and this system is a government-controlled system, you will see, how deaths and everything were reported, and you can get a kind of graph to see they've been fairly constant. And then all of a sudden, since we started using this one, there's a sudden spike of reported injuries and deaths that have occurred. Now, all they're asking you to do is state what has happened within a certain time period after getting the vaccine. They're not saying that the vaccine definitely caused it, but that's because you need to kind of finish that next phase of reviewing these issues. Because if you get a lot of people who are saying, I have a problem after taking this particular shot, even if half of them, even if 3/4 of them aren't necessarily from the shot, then you have to at least look at the remaining to say, is this something that we didn't pick up when we first released it, but now that we have, instead of 40,000 people taking it, we have 40 million, we have to really look and see, is this something that we have to be concerned about? And there is history for that as well with other vaccines that have been pulled off the market, or just not even vaccines, but medications that got approval, and then once in wide distribution and once in time, you started to notice things coming out. And you cannot shorten time, because there are some things that can be affected that literally take time to manifest because they affect people on a genetic level and not necessarily just cause an immediate response. And those are the things that we get concerned about, especially when it comes to either children who have a long life ahead of them, or even females who have reproductive issues that we need to make sure are not going to be affected down the line.
Right.
Yeah. So the concern here is that in spite of the fact that the reporting into VARS has superseded, all records over the last 15 to 20 years or so.
Easily.
This one isn't stopping.
Yeah, and that is a very odd thing, because there have been several things that when you have to go searching for it, because it's not easy to find nowadays, but when you go find certain reports of things happening, you would have said, in the old days, this would have made us take a pause, or this would have made them say, hey, we're going to hold this. And all of a sudden now it's not doing that. It's not pausing. In fact, any reference online to your big major outlets, that's your Google, that's your Facebook, that's your Instagram, Twitter, are shut down, are removed, because they will not have those conversations, even potential. There was several different groups on Facebook that had gotten formed groups to talk about, just amongst themselves, about how they had different side effects after taking their vaccinations. That groups were shut down.
Adverse effects groups.
What about the two individuals that reported last week? You had one lady that lost feeling in her arms and legs, and then you had another gentleman that was suffering. He was 19 years old, that was suffering from some sort of cardiovascular.
Right.
So it's sort of
about myocarditis.
Right. So that's the thing. How come that wasn't breaking news? I mean, that's serious.
Right. Well, and so when I bring this up to some of my colleagues, some of them are not at all impressed. They'll say, well, if you look in the literature, there's a potential side effect.
Right.
And yeah, even if it is, let's say they say it's a 1 in 100,000 chance. We're in a population of 60,000 people, and then potentially the age demographics that this is happening, it might even be a higher rate of risk. And yet here we are. So if we're already passing the amount of illness that should be for our demographics, surely that must alarm you. Surely that must make you take pause to say, do I really want to now take this and give it to all of my patients just blindly so that we can get back to normalcy, so that we can open our shops? And, how many people potentially should be hurt or will be hurt before somebody says, okay, enough's enough?
Yeah.
And we can't necessarily always take our call from what other countries are doing. We have to look to ourselves sometimes, because it has well been known that sometimes things happen in populations that don't happen in other populations. So if you're not only tracking it, because you will have people say, well, the public health system is tracking these things, but if you're not telling the people on the front line to look out for it or to make note of it, so if you're not disseminating that information, then once again, what good are you accomplishing if we're not going to pick up an issue before it's too late?
So Dr. Darling, I have to say this. So who is responsible for holding physicians and hospital staff, public health officials, politicians responsible for their behavior? For example, one of the persons who has suffered severe adverse effects, I had the opportunity to speak with them.
Mm-hmm.
They had suffered adverse effects after getting their first shot.
Mm-hmm.
When they went back to get their second shot, they started to speak about that, to say, listen, I had these adverse effects. They were ushered outside and away from everyone so they wouldn't scare other people.
Right.
So I'm trying to. It's very difficult to wrap my head around the ethics involved with that. It's like there's this other agenda going on. Like, what is the agenda now? If someone has to be ushered outside for telling the truth about their experience, and other people shouldn't be privy to that information, then what is the agenda really?
Right.
What are we doing if ethics have gone out the window and we're offering raffles and prize and incentivizing people? But it's like you share information with people and people are like, wow, so where is this information coming from? And It's like, well, this is Pfizer's advisory. And they're like, I never knew this. I had no idea. So then it becomes, well, what were you told when you went in? Oh, well, I was asked if I had read about, the vaccine on the website. And that's it. So it's like, it's very difficult. So who is responsible for this at the end of the day? Because it's like, we can't talk or we're trying to be suppressed. You say one thing to help, and next thing you know, the media's calling around and trying to pitch your colleagues against you on the news, so they don't want you to talk. If a mother tries to talk, or somebody in the community doesn't tell them you don't have the medical background to talk. If somebody who's actually experiencing the adverse effects starts to talk, they're ushered outside so people can't, like, it's that's all very concerning.
Right.
So, who do we go to for this now?
I mean, ultimately, I guess your health minister is where the buck stops. I mean, she has a chief medical officer that works to kind of coordinate your medical public health care. So he would be the top doctor that the government has assigned over to oversee all of this. But your minister of health is ultimately where the buck stops when it comes to health, just like the premier is the ultimate of all issues. And to be fair, I really don't know what they know versus what they're told versus what, if you truly want to believe something, you sometimes will gravitate to a position that will foster that belief and away from those that won't, even if they are potentially true. And so if you won't even listen to the other side, then I believe you're going to have to be held accountable if things do pan out badly, and I pray that things don't. I pray that it doesn't. And once again, this has never, for me, been about anti-vaxxing, because I'm not an anti-vaxxer, is whatever that terminology is used.
Means, yeah, like why do we even use that language? But anyway.
But I am somebody who says, hey, do you have all the data before I go and give this to my patient? Because otherwise, how do I know that I can feel comfortable just on your say-so when you don't even know all the data? So we need to be cautious, and cautious is where, and sometimes, when the pandemic started and we didn't have vaccines, the World Health Organization even had a conference in which one of their high-ranking people made a statement that if you wait till every I is dotted and T is crossed to say that this is fully safe, then you will do disjustice to the people who are dying. Sometimes you have to take chances, and I agree. But here's the problem now. You're not using that same ideal now to propagate other potential treatments for helping people get through this pandemic. You have placed all your hope, not on God, but on this vaccine. And if it doesn't pan out, and we just heard, I think this week, about one of their vaccine, all vaccine cruises, where some people tested positive, PCR testing positive. So it shows you that, once again, viruses will find a way to squeeze through. So if you put all your hope on one outlet and nothing else, then you will be sadly disappointed and potentially hurt when that wall comes crumbling down. So it's not vaccine. We're about vaccine or no vaccine. We're saying why not other things while we're kind of in this test phase of this vaccine.
Right. Exactly.
Thank you, Dr. Dowling.
Zara, I know, and we have Dr. Asa around here.
Oh, beautiful.
Yes.
And she has a wonderful research background.
Yeah, I know, and she showed up with tons of paperwork. I love it.
You should see the studio right now. Hey, it's great.
It's like a research center.
We're gonna have a nice little bonfire tonight. How about that?
Right. Yeah.
But thank you so much. If you could just, Eugene, did you want to?
No. I just had one more thing.
Yep.
I just had one more, and I'm sorry if you said this already. There was a point I had to step out of the studio, but I would like for you to talk about the mechanism of action as it relates to ivermectin, because what I've learned from my own personal research is that ivermectin is not necessarily fighting against
the virus.
Right.
Correct.
The mechanism of action inhibits the virus from being able to enter into the cells of the body. So anyway, and you're the doctor, so let me let you. But are you able to explain that?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, you have a wonderful doctor who's quite educated there who can also probably help out here, especially with her research background. But, one of the things that's very frustrating is when I hear my own colleagues and people in authority talk about how one of the first experiments on ivermectin where they used it in a cell with some, I think it was monkey cells or whatever it was, to show that it actually killed COVID-19 virus, but that the concentration was so high that it would be toxic to humans. Now, first of all, what we have realized is that that is not the mechanism behind how ivermectin would be working. It doesn't directly kind of invade the virus and kill it. Of course, if that was the way it would work, then we would have a problem because, like they said, it looks like it would be too high a concentration. What we do know about this virus is that it has to get inside of your cells, and it gets inside of your cells through what we call an ACE2 receptor on every cell that has those receptors. But it also uses a particular transport mechanism. So it's almost like, you hook it up to a train cart, and then the train cart guides it into the actual cell. So what we're seeing is that ivermectin blocks that train cart from hooking up to the virus, and then it makes the virus unable to penetrate into the cell. So ultimately, all it's doing is acting as a barrier between the virus and your cell. And if it can't get into the cell, it can't replicate. And if it can't replicate, then it can't cause some of the effects that we see. The major effect that we see is that it causes the body to respond by what we call cytotoxic nature. It produces a lot of inflammation and swelling and edema. All of this under normal circumstances is done to kill not only the virus, but potentially any cells that the virus has invaded. But sometimes what ends up happening, however, is that that mechanism turns on but doesn't turn off. So when the virus is long since dead, those responses now are just chugging away to the detriment of the patient.
Right.
What we do know, and this is where people say it can be used even before you get sick, but also once you do get sick, is it actually also helps to calm down that mechanism. So it calms down the inflammation mechanism. We think that's what fluoxetine, which is another medication that has been out on the market for years and years and years, also does. It helps calm down the inflammatory marker of this virus. This virus has taken on more of an inflammation issue than an infection issue, and as such, that's why you can't just throw antiviral medications at it, because that's not the way that this virus is actually hurting people. We have to deal with both aspects, and that's all we're asking people to do, to look at a medication that can do that can do it safely. Just picture it. You come through the airport in Bermuda, you're not vaccinated, they say, hey, you're not vaccinated, here's an option. You can either take this medication for 2 days, that's 2 days of treatment for your week here. We'll continue to do our swabbing like we would do our unvaccinated people. But in doing so, you reduce the viral load of that person, even if they're positive, from infecting somebody else. We would be in such a better position in our island.
Give thanks, Dr. Darling.
Thank you.
Really appreciate of that.
Thank you. And we appreciate you having us on.
Yes, thank you so much. Again, you're tuned in to The Outlet on Vibe 103, Bermuda's new radio show every Sunday, 10 to 12, sometimes maybe till 1. Hey, maybe till 7 o'clock. Who knows? No, I'm just joking. But yes, you could actually reach out to me, Outlet BDA 2021 on Facebook and Instagram. Also, please do not forget to donate when you can to the Crowd Justice Fund. Our lawyers are working very, very hard to fight for the people and human rights. Any donation, small or big, is so appreciated for the cause. Also, don't forget to check out beyondthepandemic.tv. Eugene Dean's just released that. He's released series 1, 2, and 3, which have been fantastic. Also, if you are just tuning in, and you don't want to sit in your car, you can access the Vibe 103 by using the app on TuneIn or on vibe103.com using Chrome or Safari. And we've also had, where the things that we have touched on are the 14-day quarantine, slightly. We've also touched on ivermectin with Dr. Dowling. Again, thank you very much. We've spoken with Dr. Sifu Reginald Can. That's gave us some good input on the whole pandemic and mental health and just taking care of yourself. But on the other side, we're going to have Dr. Amne Asaran.
Got that right.
I got that right. And we'll probably, what we'll do is we'll touch on children and pregnant women and the consent for children for the gene therapy. And again, Collie Budd's Brighter Days.
Keep it locked.
Here we go.
The station with the most vibes.